The story unfolds in 37 AD Rome, when Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known as Caligula, ascended to the throne as the third emperor of the Roman Empire at age 24. Transforming from beloved heir to the most depraved tyrant in imperial history. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill breathed with ancient power when young Gaius first pressed his palm against the cold stone of the imperial throne. The senators clustered below like carrion birds, their togas pristine white against the shadows that would soon run crimson with their own blood. He was beautiful then, golden-haired, with eyes like winter sky. But those who looked closely might have glimpsed something writhing beneath the perfect surface, a worm of madness that had been feeding on his soul since childhood. The cheers of the Roman masses still echoed through the marble halls when Gaius first tasted the wine of absolute power. They had loved him once, called him their little boot, Caligula, when he marched with his father's legions through the Germanic forests. But love, he learned, was merely another currency to be debased. The crowds who screamed his name in the Circus Maximus would scream differently soon enough. Their voices roar with terror instead of adulation. His fingers traced the golden armrest of his throne, each groove a pathway that led deeper into the labyrinth of his own corruption. In those first weeks, when hope still fluttered like a dying bird in the hearts of Rome's elite, Gaius played the role of benevolent ruler with practiced ease. He pardoned political prisoners, restored the electoral process, gave generous gifts to the people and the Praetorian Guard. The senators smiled and bowed, their relief palpable as warm breath in winter air. They had expected another Tiberius, dark and paranoid, but instead received what appeared to be a young Apollo, radiant with promise. How could they have known that beneath that divine exterior lurked something far more terrible than mere tyranny? A hunger that would consume not just lives, but the very fabric of sanity itself. The transformation began slowly, like poison seeping through veins. Gaius would stand for hours before mirrors of polished silver, studying his reflection with the intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts. His servants whispered that he spoke to the image, holding long conversations with someone who looked exactly like him, but whose eyes held depths of cruelty that seemed to stretch back to the beginning of time. "You are divine," he would murmur to the reflection, his breath fogging the silver surface. "You are above their laws, above their morality, above their weak human understanding." The mirror would nod back, and in that exchange, something fundamental shifted in the architecture of his mind. When the illness struck him in his 8th month of rule, burning through his body like Greek fire, many believed it would humble him. Instead, it seemed to burn away the last restraints of his humanity. He emerged from those fevered weeks changed, his beauty now terrible to behold, like a statue carved from ice and animated by malevolent spirits. The court physicians whispered of brain fever, of the sacred disease that struck down mortals who flew too close to the sun. But Gaius knew better. He had not been struck down by the gods. He had been elevated to join them. The first sign of his complete descent came when he ordered the Praetorian Guard to collect seashells on the beaches of Gaul, calling them spoils of war against Neptune. The soldiers, trained killers who had faced Germanic barbarians without flinching, found themselves kneeling on wet sand, filling their helmets with shells while their emperor shrieked with laughter at the absurdity of it all. This was not madness, he assured them. This was divine humor, a joke only gods could understand. The distinction between the sacred and the profane had dissolved entirely in his mind, leaving only a vast playground where the rules of morality held no sway. His relationship with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, became the subject of whispered scandals that spread through Rome like plague. The imperial banquets transformed into spectacles of degradation, where senators were forced to watch as Gaius lavished affection on his siblings that made even the most debauched Roman blush. Drusilla's death shattered what remained of his connection to human emotion, replacing grief with a rage so pure it seemed to glow with its own light. He declared her a goddess, ordered temples built in her honor, and claimed she visited him nightly in dreams that left him weeping and laughing simultaneously. The Senate sessions became theaters of humiliation, where aged senators, men who had commanded legions and governed provinces, were forced to prostrate themselves before a young man who insisted they address him as Jupiter. Marcus Flavius, a senator whose family had served Rome for 6 generations, was made to crawl across the marble floor on his belly while Gaius fed grapes to his horse, Incitatus. The old man's tears left snail trails on the pristine stone, and in those salt tracks lay the dissolution of Roman dignity itself. The other senators watched in silence, their faces carved from wax, knowing that tomorrow it might be their turn to grovel in the dust of their own destroyed honor. The games Gaius hosted in the Colosseum became legendary for their creative cruelty. He would force patrician families to fight wild beasts while he provided running commentary, describing their deaths with the analytical precision of a natural philosopher. Children were torn apart by lions while their parents watched from the imperial box, and Gaius would lean forward with the intensity of a scholar, taking notes on the exact moment when hope died in their eyes. These were not merely entertainments. They were religious ceremonies dedicated to a god whose appetite for suffering could never be satisfied. Incitatus, his beloved horse, became the living symbol of his complete break with rational governance. The animal was housed in a marble stable with a manger of ivory, attended by 18 servants who fed it oats mixed with gold flakes. Gaius would spend hours in conversation with the beast, discussing matters of state as if consulting the oracle at Delphi. When he announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the Senate fell into a silence so profound it seemed to suck sound from the very air. This was not mere eccentricity. It was a deliberate annihilation of every principle upon which Roman civilization had been built. The conspiracy that would end his reign began in whispers exchanged between men whose souls had been carved hollow by shame. Cassius Chaera, a praetorian tribune whose dignity had been stripped away piece by piece through years of calculated humiliation, found himself staring into mirrors and seeing not a soldier, but a broken thing that had once been human. The planning sessions took place in shadowed corners of the palace, grown men weeping as they plotted the death of their emperor, not from cowardice, but from the terrible knowledge that they had become something less than men under his rule. The assassination, when it came, was swift and brutal. They cornered him in a narrow corridor beneath the palace, away from his Germanic bodyguards, and fell upon him with the desperate ferocity of animals fighting for their lives. 23 wounds they carved into his flesh, each cut a prayer for deliverance from the nightmare their world had become. His blood, when it finally stopped flowing, looked no different from that of any mortal man, red and warm and utterly ordinary. The god he had claimed to be dyed like any other piece of meat, his divine pretensions leaking out through holes in his skin. But death could not contain the poison he had released into the world. The senators who had groveled before him found themselves unable to stand upright in the months that followed, their spines permanently curved by years of forced submission. The Roman people, who had cheered his ascension, discovered that some stains on the soul could never be washed clean. Children born in the years of his reign would grow up, marked by their parents' shame, carrying in their bones the knowledge that human dignity was far more fragile than anyone had dared imagine. The historians who came after struggled to make sense of what Gaius had been. Man or monster, madman or calculating tyrant. They dissected his reign like physicians examining a diseased organ, searching for the moment when virtue had transformed into vice, when the golden boy had become a creature of shadows and blood. But perhaps the most terrifying truth was that there had been no single moment of transformation. The monster had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of the beautiful young emperor, fed by power until it grew large enough to devour everything he had once claimed to love. His legacy lived on in the nightmares of those who survived him, in the way senators would flinch when entering marble halls, in the nervous laughter that followed any mention of divine emperors. Rome had learned that power without restraint was indistinguishable from madness, and madness without consequence was indistinguishable from divine will. The line between God and beast, they discovered, was far thinner than any civilized person wanted to believe, and once crossed, the journey back to humanity might prove impossible. Years later, when new emperors sat upon the throne, and the memory of Gaius had faded to cautionary tale, old men would still wake screaming from dreams of golden hair and winter sky eyes. They had witnessed the birth of something that transcended ordinary evil, a perfect fusion of absolute power and absolute corruption that had transformed a man into a force of nature, beautiful and terrible as a plague, bearing wind. In the end, perhaps that was Gaius's greatest achievement. Not the buildings he destroyed or the lives he ended, but the demonstration that the human capacity for degradation was as infinite as the stars themselves, waiting only for the right conditions to bloom into something that could make even the gods themselves weep with horror.